time to create the foundation for our automatic door animation. And to do this, we will use Unreal's powerful timeline node. As we are eventually going to blend between two location values for each of the doors, the timeline node will give us the updating float value that we need in order to do this. Although, a timeline won't be the first node in our flow, as we actually need to start from another node, and we will see why. Inside the event graph of our actor blueprint, which we can access via the graphs rollout inside the My Blueprints tab, we want to click and drag from the event actor begin overlap node's output, and then release the mouse inside the graph view. Because we earlier set up our box collision component, which allows the player to pass through it, any nodes that follow in the graph from our begin overlap node will execute whenever the player collides with a trigger. Perfect for our automatic doors. How do we actually make a timeline node in our blueprint then? Well, the first thing that we want to do is type the word timeline into the search field, and then from the list of results that appear, click the Add Timeline option, and then give it the descriptive name of Open Doors, as this will allow us to control and access values over time. What will happen here then is that our doors will start in the position that we stored in the construction script, and then open to another position when the player overlaps the box collision that we have set up, ultimately driving a blend between the two values and thus producing our animation. With the timeline created, we now want to dig into its controls then and see how we can use it to generate a float value that we can use later on. Let's double click on the timeline node header bar then to open up its options, and click the new float track button, calling it Open. Let's then right click on the timeline and choose the Add Key to Curve option, setting its time and value settings to 0. We are setting up keyframes here so as to tell the timeline what value it should be outputting at what time. As we will eventually want to use the timeline's output as a blend value, we are starting at 0 so that the blend has no effect to begin with. At this moment in time though, no pun intended, we aren't getting anything from our node, as this single keyframe is returning a value of 0 for the entire length of the timeline. Let's change this by, again, right-clicking on the timeline and adding yet another keyframe. Only in this instance, we want to set the time and value settings at 2 and 1 respectively. After a click and drag to marquee select the two keyframes, we can right-click on them and choose the User Interpolation setting from the list that appears. What we've done here is set our second keyframe up to reach its full value by the time that Unreal has run the timeline to its end. Because we want a specific motion, we have changed the interpolation type to User, which means that we have access to an ease in and ease out curve, which we'll set up so as to make it look as if the mechanism that is moving the doors takes a little time to get up to speed, and then takes some time to slow the heavy doors down. This, of course, can be adjusted to suit your preference. Although we are nearly done now, before we close out the timeline, we will want to make sure that its length is set at 2, and that the Use Last Keyframe option is checked, after which we can close the timeline tab if we want and return to the event graph. The timeline length value will control how long it takes for our animation to complete. This can be changed later if we feel that the doors need to open either a little quicker or maybe a little slower. Because our animation is designed to play to the end and stop, and then play in reverse, we have checked the Use Last Keyframe option. This is usually left off when creating looping animations, as we wouldn't want to see the stop or pause that is created by the timeline playing the last keyframe. In our case though, we definitely do want it to play that last keyframe. So we have successfully created the door opening animations, but we will of course need to create the door closing as well. And so to do this, after right-clicking in the graph view, we can type Event Actor in the search field and choose the End Overlap option from the list, after which we can click and drag from its output and connect that up to the timeline's reverse input. And as easily as that, we see that blueprints can be set up to perform complicated bits of logic with very little effort at all. Obviously, there are a number of steps to go before we can put any of this work to good use, but it shouldn't take much of an imagination at this point for us to see how the timeline node could easily be used for all sorts of very useful blueprint tools.